Hello, I'm Lillian Mills, Interim Dean of the University of Texas at Austin's McCombs School of Business. We are proud to co-sponsor the Texas Tribune's dynamic symposium, The Future of Higher Education. Thank you for joining us today, and please visit our website to learn how Texas McCombs is human-centered and future-focused. Hook 'em.
The racial and economic disparities that have long existed in this country have only been widened by the coronavirus and amplified by the most recent acts of injustice. People around the world are coming together with greater urgency to demand action. At Bank of America, we know we all have a role to play to overcome the very real consequences of systemic racism and inequity. This includes individuals, governments, nonprofits, and the private sector. Racial equality and economic opportunity are deeply connected. That's why Bank of America has committed $1 billion over 4 years to address critical gaps in affordable housing, access to health care, employment and job skills, and the resources small businesses need to succeed. We can do more, and we need to do more now to further advance racial equality and economic opportunity for all.
When teachers look out over their classrooms, they don't just see kids. They don't just see students. They see the future. Finance directors and family therapists, CEOs and PR specialists, robotics engineers and electricians, musicians and medical technicians, and of course, future teachers. Teachers not only see the future, teachers give rise to the future. Introducing the Charles Butt Scholarship for Aspiring Teachers. $8,000 annual scholarships, mentorship from teachers and principals, professional development opportunities, participation in a statewide network of Charles Butt Scholars, 100 scholarships available from 10 partner universities. Give rise to the future. Teach. For more information and to apply, visit raisingtexasteachers.org.
We didn't expect to be where we are today, but Texans are tough, and it's time to move and recover. At TSTC, we will help rebuild Texas, one skilled technician at a time. TSTC has the assistance to help you today to get where you need to be tomorrow, so that together we are stronger than ever.
I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune, and I want to welcome you to the Future of Higher Education, the Tribune's latest, greatest virtual event. This ambitious week-long symposium has been asking and answering a question critical to the well-being of Texas now and going forward. How are our public universities, private colleges, community colleges, and the like doing at achieving the various elements of their mission, including principally educating the next generation, building workforce, and setting the table of opportunity for all? All week long, we've been talking about higher ed generally, but with a special focus on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on all of the above. How these unprecedented months of disruption change the trajectory for students and families and for this state we love. Today, I'll be moderating two important conversations myself, but before we begin, I want to thank our symposium's sponsors, the Trellis Foundation, Bank of America, Texas 2036, the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin, the Texas Association of Community Colleges, the University of Arizona, Educate Texas, Philanthropy Advocates, the Greater Texas Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Raise Your Hand Texas, Texas State Technical College, and the Texas State University System. Thanks as well to our media partner, the 74 Million. If you'd like to join the online conversation, tweet using the hashtag TTEvents. Okay, let's get started. Our first session today is Building the Pipeline. We'll talk about the journey from high school to college and beyond, about recruitment, enrollment, retention, and completion with two extremely smart and experienced higher ed thinkers and doers. Lisa Blazer is the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Services at Texas A&M University. Previously, she served as Senior Associate Vice Provost for Academic Innovation at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Ruth López Turley is Associate Director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University and the Director of the Houston Education Research Consortium, a partnership between Rice and several Houston area school districts. Welcome to you both. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
It's hard to separate, you guys. It's hard to separate the broad subject of higher ed from the precise place that we are in today as we sit here. But let's attempt to do just that, leaving the pandemic aside for the moment. How do you think higher ed is doing at achieving its broadest goals, attracting students, getting them into and situated inside institutions, providing them with what they need to survive and thrive, and getting them out in a timely fashion and on their way to their productive lives? Lisa, what do you think about how higher ed is doing?
Well, I think in a lot of respects, we're doing very well. There's a lot of challenges out there with trying to get students into the pipeline and get them set up for success at the many universities. And there's so many different types of universities for students to attend. So there's lots of options for them. And so I think a lot of institutions are not only focusing on how do we get them to the university, but also how do we get them to graduate? That's one of the pivotal things that's happened over the last several years, is that many of us are focused on student success initiatives, ensuring that we're giving the right resources so that they can actually be successful and move on to that workforce of the future. And
you think you're doing a good job, generally speaking? I mean, I accept the fact that if you've seen one higher ed institution, you've seen one higher ed institution. There's no one size fits all, right?
There really is no one size fits all. I mean, many of us we're all serving different types of students on our campuses. Some institutions are more selective, and others serve a population that may struggle a little bit more and have to put more resources into helping them.
Yeah, Ruth, to that point, we have for Lisa, we have Texas A&M University, big, public, and then in case of having you join us today, we have Rice University, small, private. Is there a way to talk about the two institutions or the success of the two in the same sentence?
That's difficult to do just because there are different resources available, different groups of students, different types of students that tend to go to these institutions. Right. Research shows that in general, the completion rates tend to be higher at private institutions, and they tend to complete their degrees in a shorter amount of time as well, in general.
Yeah. Are the considerations, Ruth, for you and your colleagues at Rice different in terms of what you need to be doing to give students that path to get in and get out? What Lisa said is undeniably true. You're all focused on student success, but theoretically the tactics and the strategies are different institution to institution.
Yes, they are different from institution to institution. They are also different for different groups of students. So in our research, we're focusing primarily on more disadvantaged students, poorer students, racial and ethnic minorities. For them, in general, unfortunately, they tend to have access to fewer resources, and they tend to take longer to graduate. And therefore, we need to be very aware of these additional challenges that these groups of students face. And there are many things, of course, that institutions can do to try to help out, as well as, of course, as well as our state and federal governments. They can help out as well.
Yeah. Lisa, Ruth is talking about completion, but of course, on the front end of this, on admission, theoretically, the same thing applies, right? Different groups require different things from a recruiting them to come into higher ed standpoint, right? Not every kid coming into college is the same as well.
That is so true. I think that's where we have to really build relationships with students, engage with them, engage with their high school counselors. Not every student has the same resources in high school. And that's even especially true now, right? With so many schools still online and trying to reach out to those students. It's about that parent engagement piece as well, getting them connected to the university and to that idea of, hey, my kid can actually go to school, and I want to be there to help them, especially if they haven't experienced it themselves.
Right. You've both been doing this for a long enough time that I can ask this question with a straight face. Are we better off than we were 10 years ago in this space? Lisa, do you get a sense as it relates to all aspects of this and to both ends of the pipeline that the situation we all find ourselves in now with regard to higher ed is better than it was 10 years ago?
I really feel it is, and I'm coming at this with different perspectives. I'm at more of a flagship institution now, but I've served in a regional institution as well. And so I really feel like there's been so many more resources, especially at the institutions. We take it very seriously that we need to get students into our institutions, provide that type of access. That's how our communities are going to thrive. That's how our universities are going to thrive if we really put those resources on the map there for our students, especially once they get here as well.
So the assumption that I make from what you're saying is that from the perspective of how this is different, 10 years is a long time, and obviously everything hopefully improves over time, but the situation at a regional campus of a system like UT San Antonio is just by definition, as we would expect, different from what you might have available to you, and the way that you can employ those strategies and tactics at a place like Texas A&M.
Yes, it is different. I think it's a combination of resources, but also looking at the students that we're serving, depending on what city, your geography, where you're located, and the students that you serve. So if students are coming in maybe not as prepared, then there a lot more resources have to be put in place to actually help them get through that pipeline, to even get them to the university and then on to graduation.
Right. Ruth, same question for you. Go back 10 years, ask yourself what it was like back then. Compare that to now. Are we better off today than we were 10 years ago?
I would say in some ways, yes, but in other ways, no, because we still have a very long way to go in terms of making sure that we are providing equitable access to students in terms of access to resources, access to information.
Right.
And I'm not speaking at this point, I'm not speaking about Rice in particular, I'm just talking about in general, and especially in terms of that pipeline, that educational pipeline leading the students up to the transition to college and ultimately college completion. I think we still have a very long way to go, even though in general, things are improving. So in that sense, I definitely agree that in general, things are improving, but we have so many inequities that still, they just are so persistent and there are things that we can do to address them. And that's where I would love to push us. I would love to have an impact on pushing us in that direction, because there are things we can do and must do in order to make things more equitable for students.
Is your sense, Ruth, that the we, in the case of what you just said, we can do more or should do more, is that we at the institution level? Is it we at the policymaker level? Of course, I nerd out all the time about what can policymakers do to enable better success in higher ed. Is this something where a law has to pass or a policy has to change, or do you all at the local level, at the institution level, have more control over this?
Frankly, it's all of the above. It's going to take a lot to make these kinds of changes. Honestly, in our research, we're focusing more on the K-12 the pipeline that leads the students up to and get them ready for post-secondary access. And in that sense, we have learned through our research that there are a lot of things that we can do. In this case, we being our K-12 education system, school districts. There are things that school districts can do to make sure that our students are more likely to go to college and more likely to complete college. Now, obviously, once they get to college, then it becomes even more important. The institution's role becomes even more important. The higher education institution's role becomes more important. But even then, there are things that can happen when the students are in high school and even middle school that can make them much more likely to go to college and even much more likely to complete college. So those are the kinds of things that we're paying attention to in our research.
So, of course, I can't help but ask, name one of those things, name two of those things. What would be some of the things that you've learned are critical inputs that ultimately put them on the path to success?
That's what I was hoping you would ask. That's exactly why I was mentioning these things. Yeah. So in particular, we're finding that college advisors play a very significant role. Yeah. The college advisors in high school and frankly, as early as middle school. We have done some studies here in Houston that show that students who meet with college advisors are significantly more likely to enroll, more likely to persist, more likely to complete college. But it's very, very important that they have access to college advisors. And by college, notice I used college advisor, not counselor, because often counselors have a lot of different responsibilities, whereas college advisors focus explicitly on college advising. Unfortunately, our research also shows that often it's exactly the types of schools that have the higher proportion of poor and minority students tend to have fewer college advisors. And so this is the equity issue that I was raising earlier. Fortunately, here in Houston ISD, for the last several years, they have made huge investments in college advising, and we have been monitoring the impact of those investments, and it has been quite significant. So that's why I'm saying that, hey, there are things that need to happen in high school and frankly as early as middle school that can really set them up for a much higher likelihood of college completion.
Lisa, you're on the receiving end of that, right? So you know what students, how they come across as applicants and how they come across as potential college students, whether they've had the kind of good guidance and advising or they haven't. So would you agree that's a necessary component to making this pipeline work?
Yeah, I really would. I think that's where a partnership between higher education and K through 12 could really be beneficial. So not only do we maybe need to look at state and federal resources to help support that, but I think that's where our higher ed institutions, we have to do that outreach as well, early and middle school, build those kind of programs where we're getting students excited about coming to college, right? That's something that we need to focus on. And we can also participate through advising corps, different college advisors that we can actually provide as an institution, help support that effort as well.
Would we be having a different conversation about higher ed success and the pipeline, Lisa, if we were in a state other than Texas? You know, obviously we say if you've seen one higher ed institution, you've seen one higher ed institution. Texas is a superlative state in ways good and bad, right? Very different from every other place. Is the Texas conversation different than a Montana conversation or a Vermont conversation or even a Florida conversation in another big state would be?
I do believe it is different. I think for many reasons. If you've seen some of the enrollment cliff conversations that have been happening, we know things are going to be changing with the number of graduates that are coming out of high school. Texas is still growing. A lot of institutions, higher ed institutions, are coming into Texas to recruit. So I do feel like in Texas, we still have an opportunity to actually reach some of these students and get them into the pipeline through the programs that Ruth is talking about, as well as what the higher education institutions can do. We have more resources to be able to help with that, yes.
But you also have, Lisa, a finite number of spots. I mean, I sound like every parent who's ever had a high schooler complaining that my kid got into Harvard but couldn't get into Texas A&M or UT because there are a limited number of spaces, and the way that the laws are written, there are a certain number of automatic admits. And it is entirely possible that you can have families in Texas or students in Texas want to go to school in Texas, but not find the seat at the school that they're looking for.
I think it depends on the school. Of course, yes, there are some institutions that are more selective that may have limits on just capacity issues on how many new students they can bring into the pipeline.
Right.
But there's so many incredible regional institutions and other universities, both public and private, across the state, that students have a really great selection of institutions. So yes, were there maybe be limits on some of the flagship institutions? There's still a lot of institutions to keep them in Texas. Right. That's the collaborative effort that we need to have across the state with higher ed to get them into an institution here in the state.
You know, Ruth, Lisa talks about the growth of the population in Texas. We're now at a little bit more than 29 million in the state of Texas, and the demographers talk about us almost doubling in size in the next 30 years. Just there in Harris County where you are, you've got more than 4.5 million residents in Harris County. Harris County would be the 25th largest state, right? If Harris County was its own state. So how does the population conversation, which is obviously a crucial one for Harris County and for Houston, how does that intersect with the higher ed conversation? Are there too many people trying to get into too small a hole at the beginning of the pipeline?
Well, the ways in which the demographics come into play, especially in our research and about the issues that I was talking about earlier, it is precisely the fastest growing populations. They are the ones that are most at risk in terms of these issues, the challenges, the equity challenges that I was talking about. So we have to pay attention to the demographics. And I think that should give us even more urgency in addressing these issues of equity, because it's not just that this is the right thing for us to do. We need to help these students because they're getting less resources or less information, but because we're actually hurting ourselves, everyone, because these populations are among the fastest growing, especially in our state. So in that sense, we have to pay attention to the demographics, and that should give us even more urgency in addressing these issues.
And that really actually answers in some ways the question that I asked. Is the Texas conversation a different conversation than in other places? We now have 59% of our population is people of color. That trend line is not going to reverse all of a sudden. We're talking about having to accommodate, welcoming into higher education populations of color increasingly over time, and we need to be orienting our thinking to that specific fact, Ruth, do we not?
Exactly. And part of that has to do with not just the being aware of the additional needs that these populations have, but thinking about how our institutions of higher ed are structured, support them. It's different from how things have been in the past. In terms of when I mentioned earlier, they're taking longer to complete college. Right. So that means that our institutions of higher ed need to be structured in a way that takes that into consideration, rather than just assuming, this is a 4-year degree. Even the term, we have like 2-year institutions, we have 4-year institutions. That's now a misnomer in many places. And so we need to be aware of that. Right. In our research team at HERC, we did a longitudinal study where we tracked a cohort of over 38,000 students here in Houston from 8th grade to about the age of 30. So we tracked them for 17 years, and we saw that there was their 4-year completion rate was quite different from their 6-year completion rate and 12-year completion rate. And in this particular cohort, we started off with 8th graders, and 4 years after high school, they had a 10% completion rate. Right. 6 years after high school, they had a 21% completion rate. But then 12 years after high school, there was a 30% completion rate. Now, overall, I think that completion rate is still too low, of course, but that just demonstrates that a lot of people are taking a lot longer to finish college, and there are things that we can do in terms of our higher ed institutions to support them in that way.
Well, we have to address that fact. Lisa, I asked you earlier, well, how is this different from 10 years ago? I can assure you, I went to college a lot longer than 10 years ago, but I recall very much that at that time, 4 years was the default, right? You went in thinking it's 4 years and out, and today, if you look at the math on this, even though the public universities have gotten better on a percentage basis at getting kids out in 4 years, really, Ruth's correct. It's a misnomer to think of it as a 4-year institution if you look at most students.
Right. I think many students are taking that 5 and 6 years to graduate, and we have to recognize that some, especially when we're looking at the demographics of students that are coming into the institutions, if they aren't as prepared, or they have other obligations, they may be working while they're going to school. And I graduated a long time ago as well, and I was 4 years. I worked a little bit, but not to the extent that some students are having to work now to help support their families, to pay their way through school. So we have to recognize that and help them find that balance and help them with resources. They may get sidelined while they're attending from an emergency or a crisis. Okay, so we have to accept the fact that may happen, but get them back in into the university, back in, so that they can actually complete. We want students to complete because ultimately that will help with their earning power moving forward and get them out there into that workforce, contributing.
Right. And the fact is that, Lisa, the economics of this are not an immaterial component of this, right? The state's funding of higher education has been on a steady slope downward. We heard a lot last legislative session about how public ed funding had declined over time. So has higher ed funding. Right. Student and family debt is increasingly a problem, one that the coordinating board, among others, have attempted to address through the 60 by 30 plan. And, the cost of providing an education, even if you allow for more funding by the state or you try to solve the student debt problem, it's still expensive to provide the kind of education that Texans expect, isn't it?
Especially compared to when we all went to school. There's a lot more expectations, we're doing a lot more things personalized, which is what the generations that we're serving now, the Gen Z population that we're serving now, they want that personalization. They're paying attention to how we're delivering information to them. That takes more resources. And so we have to ensure that we're providing as much information as possible to get them into this institution and to be successful. And all of those student success measures that we're trying to do, one-on-one counseling, one-on-one advising, setting up tutors, setting up resources in the classroom, let alone the resources that all the institutions have had to do to go remote. We actually have had to invest a lot of resources in classrooms so that students are set up with technology. So that takes additional resources. It costs more to educate students, considerably more than what it did 10 years ago. Again, we still have to make it affordable for students. If we're talking about that demographic here in the state of Texas, and that demographic is going to grow, we have to figure out ways to make it affordable and look at how we distribute the resources to those students as well, and help them understand the value of that college education.
Ruth, the affordability question makes me think that there may be something to the way another aspect of the last 10 years has changed, and that is how the conversation around higher ed has changed. I don't know that it wasn't the case 10 years ago. I know that it absolutely is the case now, that you hear serious people look you in the eye and say, maybe college is not for everybody. And part of the calculation there is, I'm not sure that the amount of money that I would spend to get a degree is necessarily worth it to me. I would just soon get out in the world and start earning. Is that a good conversation to be having, do you think, at this moment?
That conversation always concerns me, frankly, let me put it crassly, because often the types of people that say that college isn't for everyone would never, ever say that to refer to their own children. So I find that very hypocritical, right? So we need to, if we're going to say that, we got to be really careful, because research shows that the value of a college degree is more important. It's more valuable now than when you're talking about comparing, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, a college education, that credential is extremely important. It's more important than it has been in the past. We all know that. And while it's true that we want to do everything that we can to make other opportunities available for people who don't go to college, or who can't go to college, or who don't want to go to college, right? We want to make sure that we have other opportunities available. I agree with that, but we have to be very careful that we're not funneling certain types of students in one trajectory and other types of students in another trajectory, right? Usually those that are more economically advantaged and white students and so on, they're the ones that are funneled in one direction, and the other students are more likely to be funneled in the other direction. And as long as that's taking place, then I'm very concerned about that statement, which is another reason why I mentioned the college advising earlier. That's where the college advisors can really help provide students with the kind of information that they need to make sure that they're choosing the endorsements, because there's some endorsements that make them that put them on the college track, and others that don't, right? So and an eighth grader, typical eighth grader, especially a poor eighth grader whose parents did not go to college, may not understand the full implications of making those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, so we have just about a minute or two left. On the subject of racial disparities, Ruth, it reminds me I wanted to ask, at least here at the end, about how the coronavirus pandemic has affected this conversation. Just as I said, well, would we be having the same conversation 10 years ago that we're having today? Would we be having the same conversation 7 months ago as we sit here? Or will we be having the same conversation 7 months from now? We've discovered among the many things that we've learned in the last 7 months that racial disparities in higher ed do really exist. And the pandemic has been harder on communities of color in many ways, but especially through the education door, it seems. Do you think that this period of time is going to have a material effect on the future of higher ed and the ability, the trajectory of these students that we're talking about?
Absolutely, unfortunately. And I just want to push back on something you just said, though, that I think that these issues have been around for a very long time.
Of course.
And it's just that they're getting heightened attention now, which is good. That's good. But the issue is that the pandemic is not, I mean, obviously it's affecting everyone in at least in some ways, but in other ways, it's having a much, much greater impact on the poor, on minorities, for a variety of reasons. And we have to acknowledge that that impact is different. And therefore, if we want to make sure that they have, equal educational opportunities or equitable educational opportunities, then we have to make sure that the impact of the pandemic is minimized as much as possible. And again, there are things that we can do to do just that. And there are school districts that are here in Houston that are doing a lot to try to address that, right? To make sure that this extended time of remote learning is, that our students that are often are the ones that are struggling the most, that they have access to all the same resources. And I'm not just talking about technology. Obviously, that's a big one. But, there are a lot of students that don't have anyone at home to help them, to supervise them, and to help them when they get stuck. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to help our district partners address.
Yeah, the complexity of this, Lisa, is really almost unfathomable. And the fact is we have to work very, very hard, much harder than normal, to ensure that we don't have a lost generation of students, honestly, regardless of race. But to Ruth's point, of course, these racial disparities have existed, but they've really surfaced in these last 7 months in an extraordinary way. And at least they concern me as it relates to higher ed, because you don't want to see kind of an entire tier of kids miss out on the opportunity that higher ed would provide them.
I would agree. And I think that's where some of the challenge is. We don't have the normal travel and college fairs where students are able to come in and find out information. So that's what, in talking to my peers, at least across the Texas A&M system and across the state, we're trying to figure out ways that we can actually reach out to those students to still keep them engaged in the conversation about going to college. We know that there's the FAFSAs. We're not seeing as many FAFSAs come through the pipeline. How do we get students to apply? They're applying late for admission. So we have to constantly push in a virtual environment. And that's where that engagement relationship piece, that's what I think we're learning from the pandemic on the recruitment side, is that we're learning that, hey, we've got other ways that we can actually reach out to these students and build even more solid relationships with them to get them in and make them feel comfortable with going to college and get their parents comfortable with that as well. Yeah. It's a lot of hard work.
Well, great answer and a great conversation with the two of you, Lisa Blazer, Ruth López Turley. Thank you so much for joining us, taking some time to talk about this important topic with us. And to everybody who tuned in, thank you very much. I hope you're enjoying our symposium and look forward to seeing you online again. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune, and I want to welcome you back to the future of higher education and to the final session of our week-long symposium. It's called Price versus Cost versus Value, and it's about the evolving economics of higher education. We'll talk about what it takes to provide an education of the first class and what it takes to acquire one, whether the state contributes enough, how the burden is borne by students and families, and the troubling levels of debt that often result, and the slightly shop-worn but still spicy question of whether the juice is worth the squeeze, whether what you get out of a degree is worth what you put in. Of course, we'll talk about the pandemic, how higher ed's ability to do what it does efficiently and affordably has been impacted by the coronavirus outbreak. I'm pleased to be joined by Archie Holmes, the Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at the University of Texas System and formerly the Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at the University of Virginia, and Jamie Merisotis, President and CEO of the Lumina Foundation, founding president of the Institute for Higher Education Policy, and the author of the just published book, Human Work in the Age of Smart Machines. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Good.
Yeah, thanks, Evan.
I thought we'd start with the moment we're in. Archie, we're in month 8 of the pandemic. What have we learned about how this unprecedented health crisis scrambles the numbers for higher ed?
So great question, Evan. I would say what we have learned so far is that our students are resilient into the ability to be able to continue their education in a wide variety of ways. So as you know, a lot of universities had, well, in the spring, but also in this fall, have had to switch a lot of courses to at least be a hybrid format. So some students are taking the courses online and some students are taking them in place. And as I've traveled around the state over the last couple of weeks, the students are doing really well. I think that they are adjusting to this new reality. I think, they miss, let's be honest, they miss being on campus. They miss seeing their friends, but they're finding that the faculty are being engaged. They're able to find their engagement.
Right. Archie, are you feeling it? Which is to say, you, the system, are the campuses in your system feeling the economic pinch as a result of what we've been going through for these months?
Yeah, absolutely. So, over the course of this time, what we have seen is that our costs have gone up in terms of being able to provide technology to students so that they can participate and in terms of creating courses. So our costs have probably gone up something in the neighborhood of just over $100 million, I would say, Evan, but also the revenue. We've also seen the revenue as our academic mission has been changed, not just our teaching mission, but also what we do in terms of service to the community and our research. And so, so we're seeing that pinch very much so. We've done some things in terms of trying to reduce administrative costs to try to do a lot of that. The CARES Act has helped, especially on the student side. We've been able to use CARES Act money to provide money. But yes, we are definitely seeing it on both the cost of providing the education during this pandemic and then what we're seeing a little bit on the revenue side.
Jamie, the national reporting on this has painted a grim picture. A story in the New York Times earlier this week cataloging the many ways that universities around the country have had to respond: elimination of majors, furloughing or full-on laying off of faculty, pausing admissions. Chronicle of Higher Education a couple of weeks back called these 8 months perhaps the most painful period in the history of higher education. Is that what you're hearing from around the country?
I think the story is pretty mixed right now nationally. I'm not sure that the story has been fully written yet. We see lots of different evidence. One clearly is that enrollment is down this fall nationally, down somewhat in four-year institutions, more substantially in community colleges. But I think the bigger issue is how we're seeing that play out in different ways. So, for example, California State University system, which went online wholly and made that announcement very early, has actually seen its enrollments go up this fall. And so you're seeing a very different message depending on where you are and what's going on. I know in Texas, we're seeing, again, certain variability. Amarillo College, for example, says that their enrollments are up this fall. So I think you're going to see different things happening in different parts of the country. But the longer term trend that Archie was talking about, I think is undeniable, which is that tuitions have been increasing faster than the rate of inflation for more than 3 decades. And more broadly, I think there's a sort of ongoing question that people have been asking, consumers have been asking, which is, what is education for? And I think the pandemic has simply accelerated that question and put pressure on higher education to respond in a thoughtful way.
Archie, you're in the business of selling a product, no different than a retail store, right? You have a product that you produce. It's called an education or a degree, and people have to buy it. Otherwise, you're out of business. So enrollment does matter. To Jamie's point, we have heard mixed news about enrollments, but the Chronicle of Higher Ed cited the following statistics over the course of these 8 months. And I think this is specifically around the idea of private colleges and universities, but I wonder if you can take that baton and apply it on the public side. overall a 2% drop in enrollment between the fall of 2019 and 2020, and a nearly 8% decrease among students who receive federal Pell Grant awards. So what we're talking about here is, of course, underserved students bearing the brunt of this worse than just the average student. Are you seeing within the UT system and what you know about the system of higher education in Texas generally, enrollment declines in that of a similar vein?
So I would say we are not seeing it to the similar vein, Evan. I think, as Jamie said, it is a very mixed message. We have a number of institutions within the system who have set records in terms of enrollment for this particular fall. I don't know the breakup in terms of financial aid versus non-financial aid. I do know that a large number of our students are receiving some amount of financial aid who are here this semester. So I think overall across the system, we are seeing an overall slight increase in terms of the number of students who are participating.
Yeah, I'd say one issue nationally that is very concerning is what we've seen is the decline in African American student enrollment, and particularly students who are in families that are facing the disproportionate impact because of COVID. Right. So here I think we've got and somewhat of a decline in the Latino population. So I think this issue of racial equity, which has sort of been a big part of the sort of theme of 2020, is being played out to a certain degree in higher education.
Yeah. And, Jamie, I'm alarmed to hear you say that community colleges seem to be worse off in this case than traditional universities, institutions, because the fact is more than 50% of higher ed enrollment in a state like Texas is in community colleges. So if community colleges are being harder hit, then that's actually bad news for a place like Texas.
That's right. And in fact, it goes against the long-standing historic trend, which is that when the economy declines, when you enter a recessionary period, community college enrollments tend to go up. This is the first time we have seen in modern memory that factor that nationally the community college enrollments are down. We think it is because of who the student population is that's being served and how how COVID is playing out. But I will say that if you look at the tremendous changes in terms of the job market, right, where are the jobs being lost, hospitality, retail, fields like that, a lot of those workers historically would have gone to community colleges to up their skill set, to get them back into the labor market as quickly as possible. If that trend doesn't happen, I think there's a long tail in terms of COVID, its recessionary effects, and frankly, its impact on building the human work ecosystem that we need going forward.
Yeah. Hey, Archie, we asked people in advance of this conversation to send us questions for the two of you. And of course, many of those questions are things that I was thinking I might ask anyway. And one of those was, why didn't you cut tuition in the middle of this? That was a persistent question heading into the fall. The spring, you all were caught flat-footed. We had to sort of pivot and do whatever we had to do to get people through the spring. But when it came time to the fall and you all knew what you were going to provide and what you were not in the way of classes in person, there was a legitimate conversation, I think, out in the world about how come you didn't make a decision to reduce tuition. Some institutions did, but some did not. You all did not. What was the conversation like around that?
So I only started October 1st, so I wasn't here to know exactly what the conversation was.
Right. But I'm sure you've heard what the conversation
was. Right. But, I think the longstanding cost of providing education, regardless of whether it is online or in person, doesn't change.
Yeah.
And that's part of it. I also think that at least initially, in terms of the ability to be able to put a lot of the materials online, to be able to transition that course, there is additional cost that the universities have borne in being able to do that. And so I think that for me, that is the main reason why the tuition hasn't been reduced, is that the fundamental cost of being able to provide an education in an online environment isn't fundamentally different than what it was before.
Jamie, is that a fair? I mean, I'm not looking for you to take on Archie on this necessarily, but I want to ask you, generally speaking, I'm the parent of a college student at the moment who has taken all of his classes online, right? I mean, that's the way this goes right now. And because my son happens to go to a public university where the tuition in Texas is, to my thinking, reasonable, I don't necessarily feel what some people may feel elsewhere. My older child went to the University of California system, and I was paying out-of-state tuition for 4 years. And I'll tell you, if she were completely online and I were paying out-of-state tuition, I'd be a lot grouchier this morning having this conversation than I am today. I mean, what some people said heading into this fall was, when you pay tuition to a university, you're paying for the full experience, which includes many of the interactions, social and otherwise, that you're going to lack in an online environment. And so really, what are we paying for? Is that a fair question?
I think it is a fair question, but it's also a question, Evan, and Archie knows this, that was coming up before COVID, right?
This is not a new conversation.
Of value existed before COVID, and
Right.
we also know that this question of what's the education for existed before COVID. So again, I think it's been accelerated. But it is a fair question. Look, the data just came out in the last few weeks nationally about tuition rates. Tuition rates actually this fall increased the lowest that they have in more than 3 decades, about 1% nationally. However, one of the things that we now know is that differential between community college and 4-year college tuition is gigantic. So let's look at a student who decides to go to a community college, first-year student, versus a student who goes to a 4-year institution. The tuition differential is 10x, $3,700 average tuition nationally in a community college compared to $37,000 in a 4-year institution. And the question I think that's fair to ask is, are you getting 10x the value, given what we're now experiencing with COVID, the questions about whether or not the online is comparable to what others are experiencing in person? Yeah. I think these are fair questions to ask.
Archie, one more specific question to the pandemic, and then I want to step back and talk a little bit more broadly about some of these issues. So you've discovered in the last 8 months that the digital divide is as bad as we thought it was, right? And access to broadband is another one of those things where there are racial disparities, there are disparities around poverty. Not everybody has access to the same level of service, and so I wonder, what have you learned in these 8 months that is a long-term takeaway? Because when we get out of this period of time, we get into what I think of as the after of this. Right. Presumably, we're going to take things that we've learned in the during, and they're going to change the way we think about how we deliver education in the after. So how does that factor into the conversation around what we're providing to students? What are the long-term impacts of what we've learned about the digital divide in the midst of this?
Yeah, so, my view on this, Evan, is I think what we have learned about this is that we need to provide different ways for students from a wide variety of different backgrounds to have access to the education that we provide, right? And so, so traditionally, right, students come for 4 years, they come to a residential experience. We are learning through the period of this about how to provide those services in a different way. And hopefully learn back and forth between what can we learn from this online experience that will make our residential experience better, and what do we need to continue to improve in the online environment. And so what I envision in the long term is that we're going to see how do students access the education that we provide start to change in a very, very different way. I think most students, at least the ones I have talked to, still relish the in-person education that we provide, and that would be their preference if we can ultimately provide it. But in terms of being able to access it, in some circumstances, they may need to be able to access some of that education not being present at a physical campus. And we need to figure out how do we then deal with the digital divide that you talked about. So part of it is working with communities to be able to figure that out. Part of that is us providing those services.
And Jamie, the fact is that we've been having, as you say, a conversation about the value of the education versus the cost for some time. And it may be that one of the positive silver linings of all this is that we finally get over this idea that we have to do things exactly the same way that we've done them over the years, and that we have to price them the same way. We may actually come out of this with an opportunity to provide a quality education based on what we've learned at a lower price point.
No, I think that's right. And, look, at the end of the day, there's a rising demand for talent in American society. Higher education has to be strong and vibrant in order to do that. But the industry can't keep delivering the way it's been delivering, at a price point that puts many people, particularly learners of color, low-income people, out of the equation. So, look, first, I think the trend that we saw before COVID, which was in the last 3 years, more higher ed institutions have closed nationally than closed in the last 20. That's because of a long-term trend, I think, here of institutions pricing themselves out of not providing that value that we're talking about. More interestingly, I think, is the ways in which we've seen merger and consolidation and collaboration. And actually, one of the best collaborations nationally for a long time is in Texas between UTEP and El Paso Community College. So 3/4 of the students that get a bachelor's degree at UTEP have earned credits at El Paso Community College. That's an extraordinary collaboration, I think, shows that you can get value. The price point at El Paso Community College is lower than it is at UTEP. You get real value, and I think those kind of collaborations and new ideas are going to be accelerating in the coming years.
Jamie, you've always been bullish on the value of higher ed. This is more of a sort of step back from the pandemic kind of question. The value proposition, a piece of this. You've been saying that college is worth it for years, that people need to be thinking about college as the first step on a path to the future economic prosperity of themselves, their families, and of society, right?
That's absolutely right, and I don't think that's changed. What has changed is the ways in which you can learn. Again, COVID has shown us that you can have high-quality learning online, maybe more so than we thought before COVID, but also that there are limitations. We also know that there are ways in which you learn in work. You learn in community-based organizations in lots of different ways. And so, to me, the question is, at the end of the day, talent is what matters. The way you get talent is a combination of education and experience. And the way you show that is through a credential, a degree, a certificate, a certification, a license, what have you. So I'm still bullish, but I think that the industry of higher education no longer has a monopoly on this concept of talent development. Others can do so, but I think we need a strong, vibrant higher ed sector in order to meet the talent needs of society, both from an economic perspective and from a social perspective.
Archie, how should employers be thinking about this question specifically? We hear a lot about the role of higher ed in providing the workforce for the future of this state, vibrant workforce, right? A skilled workforce, people who are prepared to take the jobs that are for today and for tomorrow. If somebody shows up on my doorstep as an employer without a college degree, will there be a point at which that's not going to seem like the outlier? Do you think? Are we moving away from the idea that when somebody comes in and applies for a job in some industries that the college credential is a default expectation?
I don't know the answer to that question, Evan. I mean, I'll answer the question maybe in a slightly different way. I think what Jamie is kind of referring to is, the idea that a student is going to come for 4 years and we're going to train them for all of the work-related things that they're going to experience over a long career is just not true, right? We need to think about the way of how do we integrate all of this, not only in terms of what they do in higher ed, but as Jamie said, what do they learn in their workforce, et cetera, right? So I think we need to think about that education, that training, that human development over a much longer time frame. Universities have always been challenged with, are we preparing students for their first job or are we preparing them for their career? And in some cases, those look different. Right, than each other. But I think it's very important that we attend to both of them. So I do think to some extent that first job is really important, right, in order to that signaling that we get. But how do we structure, how do we help students learn that ability to be able to adapt to the changing environment in which they're going to go into? And in that case, it's not clear to me, when let's use me as an example, right? I've had 3-4 different jobs. It was probably only my first job where they asked me about my college degree. After that, my college degree didn't really make that much of a difference in terms of how I was able to advance. And so we need to keep that in mind in terms of how we prepare our students.
Yeah. Archie, you as you say, just got to Texas, back to Texas from Virginia. I wonder how much of this conversation around price versus cost and value in higher ed is specific to Texas. Would we be having this conversation in a different way if we were in a different state, say Virginia, where you came from? Not every state has the level of population growth that we've had and that we're anticipating having. Not every state has the demographic inevitability that we now see playing out before our eyes. The populations of underserved students, families for whom in increasing numbers, sending a kid to college is a first-time thing. Is this a Texas-specific conversation different from what we would be saying if we were in another place?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not, right? I mean, it's exactly the same conversation. At the end of the day, right, folks are really interested in, and sometimes it's an economic calculation, right? I'm going to pay X amount to get this degree. How much am I going to recoup in terms of a career, in terms of it's going to make that investment available? I think in the state of Texas, we've done really well on that side. If you look at debt to income ratios of students, They're really good, not only immediately, but 5 years out. So most of our students have a debt to income ratio less than 10%. Of like 98% of the graduates out of the UT system have that sort of number. So I think we've done pretty well. Can we do better? Absolutely. But we need to look at that as at least a measure here. But it's the same everywhere.
Jamie, on this question of how first timers view this conversation in a place like Texas, which is obviously, again, changing as quickly as it possibly can be before our eyes, you are yourself a first timer. Are you not a first generation college graduate?
Absolutely,
in your own experience,
yeah.
Right?
First in my family to get a college degree, and I've said my entire career, Evan, that I was lucky. My parents didn't know what college was, except that we were going. Yep. And at the end of the day, in my family, higher education ended poverty in my family forever. And so I use myself as an example both of what's possible, but also of how the fact that luck is not a good societal strategy. We actually need a plan. And this plan, that I've spent my career working on is to get a lot more people, a lot more diverse people into and through these higher learning environments. That's what's going to power our economy and strengthen our democracy. And from my perspective, what Archie was talking about in terms of lifelong learning, which, by the way, the educators love this term lifelong learning and the consumers hate it. Consumers say, it sounds like a sentence, oh God, I'm going to have to do this forever. Yeah. But from the educator perspective, I think they need to be thinking not only about lifelong learning, which is that you're not just going to get them once, you're going to get them over the course of several times in their life, but also you need to think about this idea that you need to be providing learning to a wide group of people and a wide array of content. So rather than lifelong learning, I want to talk about wide learning, widen time, widen content, and widen people. To me, the content part in particular is the part that's going to be changing most rapidly. In terms of the way AI and automation and technology are changing work, I think we increasingly are going to need to prepare people for the work that only humans can do. And that means that higher education is going to have to increasingly be in the business of accessing our unique human traits and abilities, our empathy, our ethics, our ability to collaborate, communicate. Those are the kinds of things that higher education is going to have to focus on to ensure that it's in the wide learning game for a long period of time.
Jamie, Archie was talking about the University of Texas system's debt to income ratio, or the ratio that graduates of the system are able to claim. And, that sounds pretty good. But I wonder if you agree that across the board that we have a good handle on the student debt question. Again, back to this basic subject of the economics of higher ed and how students and families are bearing this. I was looking this week at the latest report on the state of student aid in Texas by the Trellis Foundation. And what it says clearly is that a majority of students at 2- and 4-year institutions have more debt than they expected to and are less confident that they can pay it off. Obviously, the 60 by 30 plan of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board calls out specifically the debt issue as something that they're trying to get a handle on. And I think it's questionable as to whether they're going to achieve their goals by the time 2030 rolls around. What do you think about that? The debt question.
The student debt crisis, Evan, is the slowest moving train wreck in American education history. We saw this coming in the 80s, right? We shifted more and more of the burden of paying for college to the students. We did it primarily through debt. And the net result has been high debt for certain groups of students for whom they don't have the ability to pay it back. For other students, it served them well. What's interesting is that in the last few years, total borrowing has actually gone down. In other words, the total amount borrowed has gone down, particularly once the economy started going again after the 2008-2010 recession. We saw borrowing rates moderate. However, the issue of debt for people who are not well served in the higher ed enterprise, the people for whom they have low-income family backgrounds and they don't have the capacity, one small thing can blow you off course. The car breaks down, you have a child care issue, et cetera.
Medical bills.
Most populations, debt is a very bad idea.
Yeah. Can I build on that real quick?
I wish you would, please. Yes.
So, a couple of things I think are really important here, right? I mean, we see this also in society as well, right? There's all these surveys about if you had a $500 bill appear out of nowhere, could you pay for it, right? I think we see the same thing in higher education. If you have a bill that derails you, I think it's also important to note what we need to do, I think, in higher education, and something that we emphasize in Texas is completion. If you don't complete your degree and you started, that is not a really good scenario in terms of being able to pay back your loans, right? I mean, I think it's really important for us to take on the idea, as Jamie said, right? We need to bring in a diverse set of students into our institutions, but we also need to be very committed to making sure that they complete their degrees, because that is really an important aspect of all of this.
We're quickly running out of time, but I do want to actually go a little bit longer and just ask you both just a couple of questions that are very specific to the moment we're in right now, not so much on the pandemic, but with an election coming up, and Archie, with a legislative session coming up just over the rise once we somehow get past this election, which it feels like we're never going to do. Right. Jamie, one of the conversations at the national level around higher education during this campaign has been whether we should move to some version of free college, community college for free, and possibly four-year public university for free below a certain income level. Actually, the University of Texas system and the Texas A&M system, I actually believe, do have at some income threshold, they make available these educations already at that cost. But my question to you is this really something we're going to be talking about outside of a campaign season, and should we be?
I think, look, at the end of the day, I think free college is fine. I think it is not a bad idea for the reasons that I articulated, which is that the value of higher education, the value of building talent through higher education is incredibly important, and we need to do all that we can to ensure that we close those equity gaps that I think have dogged American society for decades. However, I don't think free on its own solves the problems that Archie and I have been talking about here. I don't think free necessarily increases the completion rates. I don't think free necessarily helps get students the curricular learning that they need to power them through this sort of new human work ecosystem that I think is so important. So, I think free is fine. I think free is not a bad objective. But free is a means, not an end. And I worry in the political context that it sounds like an end, that all we need to do is make it free and then everything else will be fine. I don't think that's the case. And I'm concerned that, there's only a limited amount of political energy that you have, particularly at a national level. It takes a long time to move things through the federal system. So I want to see free tied with a broader effort around increasing completion and attainment that I think is going to be really important, again, particularly in terms of closing those racial equity gaps.
Archie, you're, again, relatively new to your job, and you've been in Texas before. You probably don't have as much experience as some in the system or some in higher ed in Texas with the legislature. We are going to have a session coming up here in January. We don't know what it's going to look like. We do know that the budget is almost certainly going to be bad, and that everybody's going to be fighting to keep what they've got. And it's going to be hard to get more money. What is the conversation that you and yours intend to have to the legislature in terms of funding? We spent a lot of time in the state over the last 2 years talking about how the state share of public education funding is down over time. Well, so is the state share of higher education funding down over time. So what do you say in the context of a legislative session, given the moment we're in and the budget that we're likely to be confronting, about the value of them funding higher ed appropriately?
I think one of the challenges always is I think the value of higher education is a long-term goal. And I think, Jamie, you were kind of getting to this, right? If you just think about free and you think you solved the problem, you haven't really addressed it, right? It's really ultimately thinking about what is the workforce that you want the state to have, let's say 10 to 15 years out. Let's just use that as a number. And how do we do the investments that we need to do now to ensure that we have that workforce, right? And so part of that is the universities, as Jamie and I have been talking about, focusing on completion rates and bringing in diverse set of learners in to be able to get that education, but then also thinking about how do we make sure that they are able to finance that in a way that doesn't lead to this exploding debt crisis that we are seeing. So for me, it's really just having that bigger, broader conversation, not thinking about what do we need to do now, but how do we invest in a way today that will make us stronger coming out of this in 5 to 10 years, let's say.
You're not really funding higher ed, you're funding economic development, and you're funding the future of the state, right?
That is correct.
That's language that I can tell you our legislature understands. That's definitely something that motivates them to act.
Well, at the end of the day, higher education is for all Texans, right? Regardless of where you live, your particular personal circumstances, right? And so higher education needs to, as Jamie has said, need to be open to all comers and deal with those equity gaps that we currently see, because that is probably the biggest driver that we have.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're more than out of time. I appreciate so much Archie Holmes and Jamie Merisotis for joining us. Thank you both. Thanks to everybody for tuning in today and all this week. Stay current on higher ed news in Texas by reading the Tribune's coverage at texastribune.org. Sign up to get all of our education coverage in your email inbox at trib.it/edu. And if we at the Tribune come out on the right side of the price versus cost versus value conversation, become a Texas Tribune member at texastribune.org/join. See you soon, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody.
We didn't expect to be where we are today, but Texans are tough, and it's time to move and recover. At TSTC, we will help rebuild Texas, one skilled technician at a time. TSTC has the assistance to help you today to get where you need to be tomorrow, so that together we are stronger than ever.